The cold bit into Lucille Evans's bones like a hungry beast, making her whole body shake uncontrollably as she huddled in the corner of the filthy jail cell. The thin, worn blanket offered little comfort against the Montana winter that seeped through the stone walls of the Silver Creek jail in 1878. "You'll freeze to death before your trial, girl," cackled the elderly drunk in the next cell. His weathered face peered at her through the rusty bars separating them. "Sheriff Wilson don't care much for heating this place, especially for the likes of us." Lucille tucked her chestnut hair behind her ears, ignoring the man's taunts. 22 years old, and she'd never imagined ending up here, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The theft of a silver brooch from the general store had been pinned on her simply because she was new in town and without connections. The real culprit was likely the shopkeeper's own niece, whom Lucille had spotted pocketing the item, but no one would take her word over that of a respected local family. "5 more days till your hearing," the drunk continued. "Might be dead by then." Lucille closed her eyes, willing her teeth to stop chattering. Her traveling money, all $53 of it, had been confiscated upon arrest. The bail had been set at $75, an impossible sum for a woman who'd arrived in Silver Creek just 3 days prior with hopes of securing a teaching position. The jailhouse door swung open with a piercing creak, sending a blast of cold air through the already frigid room. Sheriff Wilson's heavy boots announced his arrival, followed by the lighter tread of another man. "That's her," the sheriff said, nodding toward Lucille's cell. "Don't know why you'd waste good money on a thief, Quinn." Lucille looked up, catching sight of a tall figure standing beside the sheriff. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast from his wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in stubble that hadn't seen a razor in several days. "I'll be the judge of my own money, Sheriff," came the stranger's deep voice. "And I don't recall asking for your opinion on the matter," the sheriff grunted, jingling his keys. "Suit yourself. $75 it is then." The stranger reached into his coat, pulling out a leather pouch. He counted out the money slowly, deliberately, while Lucille watched in stunned silence. "Who was this man, and why was he paying her bail? Consider it done," the stranger said, handing over the money. Sheriff Wilson counted it twice before nodding. He moved to Lucille's cell, unlocking it with a rusty key. "You're free to go, Miss Evans, though I'd advise you to leave town. Your kind ain't welcome here." As Lucille rose shakily to her feet, the stranger finally stepped into the light. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with intense blue eyes that studied her carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, a sheepskin coat over a flannel shirt, durable pants tucked into scuffed leather boots, and that well-shaped hat that marked him as a man who spent most of his time on horseback. "Clayton Quinn," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "I heard about your situation. Gather your things if you have any. My horse is outside." Lucille hesitated, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders. "Why would you help me, Mr. Quinn? You don't know me." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Let's just say I've got my reasons." "Unless you'd prefer to stay," the drunk in the next cell cackled again. "Take the offer, girl. Next one might not be so pretty." Lucille glared at the old man before turning back to Clayton. "I have nothing but the clothes I'm wearing. They took my bag when I was arrested." Clayton nodded at the sheriff. Her belongings, with clear reluctance, Wilson retrieved a small carpetbag from a cabinet behind his desk. He thrust it toward Lucille without making eye contact. "Don't let me see your face in Silver Creek again." Clayton took the bag from the sheriff's hands and offered his arm to Lucille. "Shall we?" Outside, the cold was even more biting, but at least the snowfall had stopped. The main street of Silver Creek was quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few townsfolk hurrying about their business. They cast suspicious glances at Lucille and her unexpected companion. A large chestnut gelding stood hitched outside the jailhouse, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. The horse was well-muscled and alert, with intelligent eyes that followed their approach. "This is Copper," Clayton said, patting the horse's neck. "He's sturdy enough to carry us both until we can find you something of your own." "Us both? Where exactly are we going, Mr. Quinn?" Lucille asked, suddenly wary despite her desperate situation. Away from here, he replied simply, securing her bag to his saddle. And call me Clay. Mr. Quinn was my father. He mounted in one fluid motion, then extended his hand down to her. Lucille stared at it, torn between fear of this stranger and fear of remaining in a town that had already condemned her. I don't make offers twice, Miss Evans, Clay said quietly. And nightfall's coming. Decision made, Lucille grasped his hand. With surprising strength, he pulled her up behind him on the saddle. Hold on, he instructed, and Lucille tentatively placed her hands on his sides. Tighter than that if you don't want to fall off. Reluctantly, she wrapped her arms around his waist, immediately aware of the solid warmth of him against the cold. Clay clicked his tongue, and Copper moved forward at a steady walk. As they passed the general store, Lucille spotted the shopkeeper and his niece watching from the window. The young woman's face paled at the sight of Lucille, guilt written clearly across her features. That's her, Lucille whispered against Clay's back. The niece. She's the one who stole the brooch. Clay didn't reply immediately, guiding Copper down the main street toward the edge of town. Only when they had passed the last building did he speak. I know, Lucille stiffened. You knew. How? I was in the store that day, saw her pocket it while you were looking at the books. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. Tried to tell the sheriff, but Bartlett's family has owned half this town for 3 generations. My word against theirs wasn't worth much. Then why help me now? Lucille pressed, confusion mounting. Clay urged Copper into a trot as they headed into the open country. Because nobody deserves to be punished for something they didn't do. And because I'm heading north to my ranch, and the journey's long enough that company wouldn't hurt. Lucille fell silent, processing this information as they rode. The cold was still bitter, but Clay's body blocked much of the wind, and the physical exertion of staying mounted generated some warmth. After nearly an hour of riding, the landscape changed from open plains to scattered pine forests. Clay guided Copper off the main trail and into the trees, following what appeared to be a game path until they reached a small clearing. We'll stop here for the night, he announced, dismounting with ease. He reached up to help Lucille down, his strong hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. Her legs felt wobbly after the ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. Clay steadied her with a hand on her elbow. First time riding. First time in many years, she admitted. My father taught me as a child, but after he died, we sold the horses. Something flickered in Clay's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. He nodded once before turning to unsaddle Copper. There's a creek about 50 yards that way, he said, gesturing east. Good water. I'll get a fire going. By the time Lucille returned with water, Clay had indeed started a small fire and erected a simple lean-to shelter using canvas from his pack. The arrangement was rudimentary, but would provide protection from the elements. You seem practiced at this, Lucille observed, setting down the canteen he'd given her. Clay was busy preparing some kind of stew from supplies in his saddlebags. 7 years in the territories teaches a man how to survive outdoors. He glanced up at her. You should eat something. Doubt that jail food was worth much. He wasn't wrong. Lucille accepted the tin plate he offered, filled with a surprisingly flavorful mixture of beans, dried meat, and what might have been potatoes. They ate in silence for several minutes. Why were you in Silver Creek? Clay finally asked, setting aside his empty plate. Lucille sighed. I came from St. Louis. I was a teacher there, but the school closed when the funding dried up. I heard Montana Territory needed educators, so I used my savings to come west. She stared into the fire. Silver Creek was my 3rd stop. The previous towns already had teachers. Long way to come alone, Clay commented. I had little choice. My mother died last winter and I have no siblings or other family. She looked up at him. What about your ranch? Is it far? Another 4 days' ride, weather permitting, he replied. It's not much yet, 100 acres, cabin, small herd of cattle, but it's mine. There was pride in his voice that Lucille couldn't help but respect. And you manage it alone, a shadow passed over his face. Had a partner once, Josh. We came out together from Texas in '71. He was killed by rustlers 2 years back. I'm sorry, Lucille said softly. Clay shrugged, but the casual gesture couldn't hide the pain in his eyes. Part of life out here, You learn to move forward. As darkness fully descended, the temperature dropped further. Lucille found herself shivering despite the fire's warmth. "Here," Clay said, removing his heavy coat and handing it to her. "Take this." "But you'll be cold," she protested. "I'm used to it." When she still hesitated, he added, "Consider it self-interest. Can't have you falling ill before we reach the ranch." Reluctantly, Lucille accepted the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It carried his scent leather, pine, and something uniquely him. "Thank you." Clay nodded, then gestured to the lean-to. "You should get some sleep." "We'll head out at first light." Lucille crawled into the shelter, using her carpet bag as a pillow and Clay's coat as an additional blanket over the bedroll he'd provided. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she listened to Clay moving around the campsite, tending to copper and banking the fire. Eventually, he settled on the opposite side of the fire, his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his lap. "Aren't you going to sleep?" Lucille asked. "Someone needs to keep watch," he replied simply. "From what?" He was quiet for a moment. "Wolves, bandits, take your pick." Lucille propped herself up on one elbow. "I can take a turn watching if you'd like." That earned her a rare smile, brief but genuine. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Evans, but I don't sleep much anyway. Old habit from the war." "You fought in the war?" she asked, surprised by this revelation. "Last year of it. I was young, barely 18 when I joined up with the Union. My father as well," Lucille said softly. "He came home, but was never the same. The cough from the prison camp eventually took him." Clay nodded, understanding in his eyes. They shared a moment of silence for those lost to that terrible conflict that had divided the nation just 13 years earlier. "Get some rest, Lucille," he finally said, using her given name for the first time. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Somehow, hearing her name on his lips made sleep come easier, and Lucille drifted off to the sound of the wind in the pines and Clay's occasional soft words to Copper. The following days fell into a pattern. They would ride from dawn until dusk, stopping only briefly to rest Copper and eat simple meals from Clay's provisions. At night, they made camp, and Clay always insisted Lucille take the shelter while he kept watch for at least part of the night. By the third day, Lucille had stopped protesting this arrangement, recognizing the stubborn set of Clay's jaw when he'd made up his mind. They talked during these days cautiously at first, then with increasing openness. Clay told her about his ranch, his small herd of cattle, and his hopes to expand once he had the capital. Lucille shared stories of her teaching days, her students, and her own dreams of someday starting a school in one of these frontier towns. "Why teaching?" Clay asked on the evening of their third day together as they sat beside a fire at the edge of a vast grassland. Lucille smiled, remembering. "There was a teacher when I was a girl, Miss Hartford. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I was shy, always hiding behind books. She encouraged me to share what I learned to help others. It felt right somehow," Clay nodded, understanding. "Like the land felt right to me. First time I rode through these territories, I knew this was where I belonged." "Do you ever get lonely?" Lucille asked before she could stop herself. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've got Copper, the cattle. Work keeps a man busy enough not to notice most days. And the other days," his blue eyes met hers across the flames, "those are the hard ones." On the fourth day, they crossed into an area Clay called his neighboring country, rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen groves. The weather had improved somewhat, with bright sunshine that took the edge off the winter chill. "We should reach the ranch by tomorrow afternoon," Clay informed her as they stopped to rest Copper near a small stream. "If the weather holds." Lucille nodded, suddenly unsure of what awaited her at their destination. Clay hadn't specified what would happen once they reached his property, and she hadn't asked. The question of her future hung between them, unaddressed. "Clay," she began hesitantly, "I want to thank you for what you've done, not just paying my bail but bringing me with you. It was more kindness than I expected to find out here." He was adjusting Copper's saddle and didn't immediately look at her. "No need for thanks. Couldn't leave you there. Still, I'm grateful, and I want you to know that I won't be a burden. Once we reach your ranch, I can find work nearby. Perhaps there's a town about 15 miles from my place," he interrupted, finally turning to face her. Pinewood, small but growing, they've been looking for a teacher. Lucille's heart leapt at this news. Truly, Clay nodded. Mentioned it in a letter to me a month back, the town council, that is. They've built a schoolhouse but have no one to teach in it. He hesitated. If that interests you. It would be perfect, Lucille breathed, hardly daring to believe such fortune after everything that had happened. A ghost of a smile touched Clay's lips. Then that settled. That evening, as they made camp for what would be their final night on the trail, something had shifted between them. The conversation flowed more easily, and Lucille noticed Clay watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. As they finished their meal, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fire and distant howl of a coyote. "Why did you really help me, Clay?" Lucille finally asked the question that had been on her mind since leaving Silver Creek. The truth this time. Clay set aside his plate, considering his words carefully. "When I saw you in that store before all the trouble, you reminded me of someone. Who, myself, oddly enough," he admitted. "Someone out of place trying to find their way, and then when they accused you wrongly." He shook his head. "I've been judged unfairly before, know what it's like. Because of the war," Lucille guessed. "Partly. And partly because I chose to make my own way rather than follow my father into banking." His voice held old bitterness. "He called it a fool's errand coming west. Was he right?" Clay looked around at the vast landscape, the stars emerging above them. "No, this is where I belong." His eyes returned to her, but it would have been easier with someone to share it with. The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them. Lucille felt her cheeks warm, and it wasn't from the fire's heat. "I should check on Copper," Clay said abruptly, rising to his feet. Lucille watched him walk to where the horse was tethered, noting the straight set of his shoulders and the careful way he moved, always alert, always watchful. In just 4 days, she'd come to rely on that vigilance to feel safe in his presence. When he returned, Lucille had made a decision. "I'd like to try," she said quietly. Clay paused, confusion evident on his face. "Try what, Pinewood? Teaching there?" She took a deep breath. "And getting to know you better, if that's something you might want." For a moment, Clay stood perfectly still, the firelight casting shadows across his features. Then, slowly, he moved to sit beside her rather than across the fire as he had each previous night. "I'd like that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Very much." They sat together in silence, shoulders almost touching, until Clay finally spoke again. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow's an important day." For the first time since they began their journey, Clay slept near the shelter rather than by the fire, though still maintaining a respectful distance. Lucille fell asleep aware of his presence just feet away, and for once, her dreams were peaceful. Morning brought clear skies and warmer temperatures. They packed quickly and efficiently, having established a routine over their days together. Clay seemed lighter somehow, smiling more easily as they rode through increasingly familiar territory. "That ridge there marks the boundary of my land," he pointed out mid-morning, indicating a rocky outcropping in the distance. "Once we cross it, you'll be able to see the valley where the ranch sits." As promised, when they crested the ridge an hour later, a spectacular view opened before them. A verdant valley stretched below, bisected by a winding creek. Near its center stood a sturdy log cabin with a barn and corral nearby. Several dozen cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the winter-pale grass. "It's beautiful," Lucille breathed, genuinely impressed by the sight. "It's not much," Clay said, though pride was evident in his voice. "But it's home." They descended into the valley, Copper picking up his pace as he recognized familiar ground. As they approached the cabin, Lucille noted the careful craftsmanship of the structure, solid logs notched together with precision, a proper stone chimney, windows with real glass. "Did you build this yourself?" she asked as Clay helped her dismount in front of the cabin. "Josh and I did, yes," he replied, a momentary sadness crossing his face at the mention of his lost friend. "Took us most of that first summer." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, wooden table and chairs, and a surprisingly well-stocked bookshelf that caught Lucille's attention immediately. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. "You can take my room," Clay said, seeing her glance at the doors. "I'll use the spare." I couldn't put you out of your own bed, Lucille protested. It's no trouble. Spare room was Josh's, been empty too long anyway. Clay set about lighting a fire and heating water while Lucille explored the cabin. Despite its frontier location, the place showed signs of refinement: handmade quilts, a set of decent dishes on open shelves, even a small collection of framed sketches on the walls. Did you draw these? She asked, examining a detailed rendering of the valley. Clay glanced up from the fire. Yes, something I do in winter evenings, not much else to occupy the time when the snow's deep. They're wonderful, Lucille said sincerely, impressed by this hidden talent. A flicker of pleasure crossed Clay's face at her praise. Thank you. Never had much audience for them before. Once the fire was blazing and water heating, Clay excused himself to tend to Copper and check on his cattle. Left alone, Lucille found herself drawn to the bookshelf. The collection was eclectic practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, alongside volumes of poetry, history, and even several novels she recognized. She was so absorbed in examining the books that she didn't hear Clay return until he spoke from the doorway. My mother's, he explained, seeing her surprise at the diverse collection. She insisted I bring them when I left Philadelphia, said a man needs food for the mind as well as the body. She sounds like a wise woman, Lucille replied, carefully reshelving a volume of Wordsworth. She was, Clay agreed, a fond smile softening his features. Would have liked you, I think. The simple statement warmed Lucille more than she expected. Is she? Passed 4 years ago, pneumonia. Clay moved to check the water on the stove. Father's still in Philadelphia, running the family bank. We exchange letters at Christmas, not much more. I'm sorry about your mother, Lucille said softly. Clay nodded his thanks, then gestured to the steaming pot. Water's hot if you'd like to wash up. I need to ride over to check the north pasture, but I'll be back before dark. Make yourself at home. After he left, Lucille took the opportunity to properly clean up for the first time in days. Clay had shown her to a small room off the kitchen that served as a washroom, with a metal tub that could be filled for bathing. The hot water was a luxury she hadn't expected, and Lucille took her time washing away the dirt of the trail. She changed into her spare dress, wrinkled from being in her bag, but clean, and did her best to make herself presentable. By the time Clay returned, she had explored the kitchen and prepared a simple meal from the surprisingly well-stocked pantry. You didn't have to cook, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. His hair, freed from the hat, fell across his forehead in a way that softened his appearance considerably. I wanted to, Lucille replied. It's the least I could do after everything. They ate together at the wooden table, and for the first time, their meal wasn't accompanied by the sounds of the wilderness. Instead, the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers created a cozy atmosphere that felt almost domestic. Tomorrow I can take you into Pinewood, Clay offered as they cleared the dishes together. Introduce you to the town council. They'll be pleased to finally have a teacher. Lucille nodded, though she felt a twinge of uncertainty at the thought of starting over yet again in a strange place. Do you think they'll accept me, after what happened in Silver Creek? Clay's expression hardened slightly. Silver Creek has always been trouble, Pinewood's different decent folks trying to build something lasting. And besides, he added, you'll have my recommendation. That counts for something there. His confidence bolstered her spirits. Thank you. Later, as they sat by the fire, the conversation turned to more personal matters. Have you ever been married, Clay? Lucille asked, curiosity finally getting the better of her. He shook his head. Came close once, back in Pennsylvania before the war. Elizabeth Harrington, daughter of one of my father's associates. A rueful smile crossed his face. When I chose the Union Army over my father's bank, she chose a banker's son over a soldier. Her loss, Lucille said without thinking, then blushed at her own boldness. Clay's eyes met hers, something warm and appreciative in their blue depths. What about you? He asked. No husband in St. Louis? No, there were opportunities, I suppose, but... She hesitated, trying to articulate feelings she'd rarely examined. Teaching was my priority, and the men who showed interest seemed to expect me to give that up. I couldn't imagine a life confined to keeping house and nothing more. Yet here you are, cooking in my kitchen, Clay observed, though his tone held no judgment. By choice, Lucille clarified. That's the difference. Clay nodded slowly. I've always thought a partnership should be just that, each person bringing their strengths supporting the other. He glanced around the cabin. A place like this needs that balance to thrive. His words resonated with Lucille's own beliefs more than she'd expected. In the growing comfort between them, she found herself imagining what life might be like here, teaching in Pinewood by day, returning to this cabin in the evenings. To Clay, the thought both thrilled and terrified her. They'd known each other less than a week, yet she felt a connection to this quiet, principled man that she couldn't easily explain. It's getting late, Clay finally said, rising from his chair. The ride to Pinewood takes a few hours. We should start early. Lucille nodded, suddenly nervous about tomorrow and what it might bring. Good night, Clay, and thank you again for your hospitality. No thanks needed, he replied, his voice gentle. Having you here, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. It makes this place feel more like home than it has in a long time. With that simple but profound statement, he retired to the spare room, leaving Lucille to consider his words as she settled into his bed. The sheets carried a faint scent of pine and leather, his scent, and she found it oddly comforting as she drifted off to sleep. The journey to Pinewood the next morning took them through rolling countryside dotted with small farms and homesteads. Clay had insisted Lucille ride his spare horse, a steady mare named Willow, rather than sharing Copper again. Town's growing, Clay commented as they approached. Another dozen families settled here just this past year. Pinewood proved to be exactly as Clay had described, small but thriving, with a main street lined by wooden buildings in various stages of completion. A general store, blacksmith, saloon, and what appeared to be a hotel were already established. At the far end of the street stood a white clapboard building that could only be the schoolhouse, complete with a small bell tower. The townspeople greeted Clay with obvious respect and warmth, and he introduced Lucille to so many people that she struggled to remember all their names. The town council, consisting of the general store owner, the blacksmith, and an elderly former judge, were delighted to meet her. A qualified teacher from St. Louis, exclaimed Mr. Donnelly, the storekeeper. Providence has smiled on Pinewood today, Miss Evans. The schoolhouse was simple but well built, with rows of benches, a teacher's desk, and a small stove for heating. A room at the back had been prepared as living quarters for the teacher, sparsely furnished but clean and private. We can't offer much in salary, Judge Wilkins explained apologetically. $15 a month plus the quarters, and families will contribute supplies. It's more than fair, Lucille assured him, already envisioning how she would arrange the classroom. By midday, the arrangements had been made. Lucille would begin teaching the following Monday, giving her a few days to prepare and settle in. The council was even willing to advance her first month's salary to help her purchase necessary items from the general store. As they prepared to leave town, Clay surprised her by stopping at the general store. Wait here, he said, dismounting and going inside. He returned a few minutes later with a package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Lucille asked as he handed it to her. Just something I thought you might need, he replied, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident manner. Lucille unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and several pencils. For your lesson plans, Clay explained, and whatever else you might want to write. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Lucille deeply. Thank you, she said softly. It's perfect. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their journey into town, both lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. The reality of their situation was becoming clear. Lucille would soon be living in Pinewood, while Clay remained at his ranch 15 miles away. As they approached the cabin, Clay finally broke the silence. I know it's a distance between the ranch and town, he began, but the trail's good and I come in for supplies regularly. Lucille nodded, understanding his unspoken message. I would welcome your visits. Clay's eyes met hers, and the connection between them seemed to strengthen. And perhaps sometimes you might visit here, when school allows. I'd like that very much, Lucille replied, her heart quickening at the possibility. That evening, their last together before Lucille would move to the schoolhouse. A strange blend of contentment and melancholy settled over the cabin. They shared another meal, talked easily about books they'd both read, and avoided discussing the impending separation. Finally, as the fire burned low, Clay set aside his coffee cup and faced her directly. "Lucille, I need to say something." The serious tone of his voice made her nervous. "Yes. I know it's been less than a week since we met, and under unusual circumstances at that." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "But in that time, I've come to care for you in a way I didn't expect." Lucille's breath caught in her throat. "I feel the same," she admitted quietly, relief and pleasure mingled on Clay's face. "I'm not asking for promises. We barely know each other, and you deserve time to settle into your new position without complications." He leaned forward slightly. "But I want you to know that my interest in you is sincere, and if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly." His formal request, so earnest and respectful, brought tears to Lucille's eyes. "I would be honored, Clayton Quinn." The smile that spread across his face transformed him, erasing the weariness and wariness she'd first seen in the Silver Creek jail. On impulse, Lucille reached across the table and placed her hand over his fingers immediately entwined with hers, strong and warm. "We'll take it slowly," he promised. "Give ourselves time to be sure." Lucille nodded, though her heart already felt surprisingly certain. In this man who had rescued her from a jail cell and shown her nothing but kindness and respect, she sensed a partner who would value her mind as well as her heart. "I should warn you," she said with a small smile. "I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I have very definite ideas about education." Clay's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I should warn you that I'm equally stubborn, sometimes work too hard, and have been told I'm too serious for my own good." "We'll balance each other then," Lucille suggested. "I believe we will." The next morning brought the reality of separation, but also the promise of a future. As Clay helped Lucille mount Willow for the ride to Pinewood, he pressed something into her hand. "So you'll remember where to find me," he said softly. It was one of his sketches, the cabin and surrounding valley, rendered with careful attention to detail. At the bottom, he'd written simply, "Until next time." Lucille carefully tucked it into her journal. "I won't need this to remember," she assured him, "but I'll treasure it nonetheless." Clay's hand lingered on hers. "Sunday," he said. "I'll come to town on Sunday if that's agreeable." "Very agreeable," Lucille replied with a smile. As they rode toward Pinewood, side by side this time rather than one behind the other, Lucille marveled at how drastically her life had changed in just a few days. From shivering in a jail cell, accused of a crime she didn't commit, to riding toward a new beginning with a man who saw her worth and valued her dreams. The Montana winter still held the land in its grip, but spring would come eventually, bringing new growth to Clay's ranch and new students to Lucille's classroom. And in the warming days ahead, they would discover together what could bloom between a cowboy and the teacher he had rescued on a cold winter day.